Is Theravāda a civilization? Big idea, bigger conversation. Can a religion also be a civilization? The editors of the Routledge Handbook argue yes. In places like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, Theravāda has shaped how people think, govern, and relate to family for centuries, and those same people have shaped Theravāda right back. It's a two-way relationship between belief and culture so deep that scholars call it civilizational, on par with how we talk about Western civilization.
A tradition that has preserved its sacred texts word for over 2,000 years, through empires, colonialism, and the modern world, is now being asked a question it has never had to answer before.
Scholars who study Theravāda Buddhism admit something surprising. There's no single Theravāda tradition, and no fixed checklist of features that make something count as Theravāda. It's practiced differently in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, and each community defines itself a little differently. According to the Routledge Handbook of Theravāda Buddhism, edited by Dr. Stephen Berkowitz and Ashley Thompson, the term is best understood as a category scholars and practitioners still argue about, not a fixed essence handed down unchanged for 2,500 years. For centuries, some Mahayana traditions used a dismissive label, the lesser vehicle, to describe Pāli-based Buddhism. Western monks and scholars in the 20th century helped popularize Theravāda, instead, as a more respectful, unifying name for the coherent school found across Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. It wasn't just academic, it was a shift in identity and dignity for millions of practitioners.
Today, we're unpacking Theravāda Buddhism, not just as a religion, but as a civilization. We'll cover how its identity was built, how it has shifted over centuries, and
the three baskets. What's actually in the Pāli Canon? Ever wonder what's actually inside the Buddhist scriptures? The Pāli Canon, called the Tipitaka, or three baskets, is divided into three parts: the Vinaya, monastic rules; the Sutta, the Buddha's discourses; and the Abhidhamma, detailed philosophical analysis of mind and experience. Different Theravāda countries actually emphasize different baskets. Myanmar, for example, has historically placed more weight on Abhidhamma study than its neighbors. Even sacred texts aren't used identically everywhere.
joining me is someone who has gone deep into the scholarship on this. Let's get into it. So, just to set the stage, when we say Theravāda is a civilization, what do we actually mean by that?
Right, so the word itself is a good place to start. Theravāda is a compound of two Pāli words, Thera, meaning elder, and Vida, meaning doctrine or school. So it literally translates as the doctrine of the elders. And that name is doing a lot of work. It's not just a label, it's a claim of historical and doctrinal primacy, asserting an unbroken lineage all the way back to the Buddha's immediate disciples.
So the name itself is almost a mission statement.
Exactly. And according to Buddhist Learning for All's detailed exposition of the tradition, Theravāda's identity rests on three interdependent pillars that have sustained it for over 2 millennia. First, the scrupulous preservation of the Buddha's teachings in the Pāli language. Second, strict adherence to the monastic discipline, the Vinaya, as codified by the Mahavihara lineage of Sri Lanka. And third, the comprehensive path of practice laid out in commentarial masterworks like the Visuddhimagga.
3 pillars: text, discipline, and practice. That's actually a pretty elegant architecture for a civilization.
It is. And what's interesting is that the tradition also had another name for itself in its classical literature, Vibhajavida, which means the analysts, or those who make distinctions. This refers to its methodological approach to doctrinal inquiry. The Vibhajavidins analytically distinguished between what exists in an ultimate sense and what exists only by conventional designation, and they rejected both extremes of eternalism and nihilism.
Wait, so they were calling themselves the analysts? That's almost like a philosophical branding move.
It really is. And it tells you something about how seriously this tradition took intellectual rigor alongside spiritual practice. This analytical spirit, as the sources describe it, infuses the entire Abhidhamma project, which is basically Theravada's systematic philosophy. So where does this all begin historically? Like, what's the origin story?
So according to Wikipedia's history of Theravāda Buddhism, the tradition traces its lineage to the first Buddhist council, said to have been held at Rajagaha 3 months after the Buddha's passing, traditionally dated to 483 BCE. The aim was to collectively recite and preserve the teachings. The Venerable Inanda recited the discourses, while Upali recited the Vinaya.
So it starts with an act of collective memorization. That's remarkable.
Right. And then Theravāda specifically places itself within the Stavira faction that emerged from the Second Council at Vesela, held around 383 BCE. That council was convened to adjudicate disputes over monastic discipline, things like handling money and storing food. It's a schism over rules, not theology. And that's actually very revealing about what Theravāda cares about most.
Rules as identity. That's going to become really important later when we talk about the Bhikkhunī debate, isn't it?
Completely central. But first, the spread. After establishing itself in the Sri Lankan Anuradhapura kingdom, Theravāda spread throughout mainland Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, through the efforts of missionary monks and Southeast Asian kings. So by the medieval period, you have this vast civilizational zone unified by Pāli texts, shared monastic codes, and royal patronage.
And then colonialism hits.
According to Wikipedia's history, in the modern era, Theravāda faced serious challenges from Western colonialism and Christian missionaries. And the response was fascinating. Various Buddhist modernist movements arose. Sri Lankan modernism under Anagarika Dharmapala, the Burmese Vipassana movement, the Dhammayuttika Nikaya as a new Thai monastic order. These weren't retreats, they were reinventions.
So the tradition was actively reshaping itself under pressure. It wasn't just static.
Not at all. And the modern era also saw Theravāda become genuinely international, with centres in the Western world and movements developing in countries like Nepal and Vietnam that weren't traditionally home to it. So when people talk about Theravāda as a fixed, unchanging tradition, the history actually tells a more complicated story.
Yeah, and there's actually a really interesting wrinkle in that history of preservation. I came across research by Primoz Petsenko from the University of Queensland, published in the Changhua Buddhist Journal, where he discovered lost Pāli sub-commentary manuscripts in Burma, texts that both the Theravāda tradition itself and modern Pāli scholarship had essentially ignored or considered non-existent.
That's a striking finding. What does it suggest?
It suggests that even a tradition built on meticulous preservation can have blind spots in its own history. Petsenko's argument is that the sources for the available history of Pāli literature need to be re-examined, that older bibliographic texts are actually more reliable than the later sources that modern scholarship has relied on. So the tradition's self-image of perfect continuity is itself a construction.
That's a really important point, because the claim of unbroken transmission is foundational to Theravāda identity.
Buddhism beyond the books. Stupas, statues, and stone. Not all Buddhist traditions live in books. A lot of it is literally carved in stone. Theravāda has always been transmitted through material culture too. Stupas holding relics, boundary markers called sima that define monastic space, inscriptions on stone and palm leaf, and countless Buddha statues. Each of these carries local meaning that can differ completely from one region to the next, even when the object looks similar. What is Theravāda Buddhism? According to the scholars behind the Routledge Handbook, there isn't a single clear answer, and that's the point. Theravāda is a living, evolving category built from contested texts, disputed history, changing labels, material culture, and ongoing debates like Bhikkhunī ordination. Understanding it means embracing the contradictions, not smoothing them over. That's what real Buddhist studies, and real Buddhist practice, actually looks like.
I think it comes down to a question that every long-lived civilization eventually has to face. Does continuity mean preservation or restoration? Theravāda built its identity on the claim of an unbroken lineage. But the Bhikkhunī order was part of the original dispensation, established by the Buddha himself. So if that lineage was broken, restoring it could be seen as the more faithful act.
That's a really powerful reframe. Restoration as the more conservative position.
And that's exactly how the pro-Bhikkhunī scholars frame it. They're not arguing for innovation, they're arguing for recovery. The Karui Sivana documentation puts it this way. The Bhikkhunī Saiga is re-emerging not as something new or external, but as a restoration of an original and essential part of the Buddha's dispensation.
And the opposition would say, the mechanism of transmission matters as much as the content being transmitted.
Exactly. For Ohonisaro Bhikkhu and those who share his position, the validity of the ordination process is inseparable from the validity of the ordination itself. You can't have the fruit without the tree.
And yet, as Anilayo points out, the parties have often been talking past each other, neither side fully engaging with what actually underpins the other's position.
Which is maybe the most important practical takeaway from all of this. The debate is real, the stakes are real, but the conversation has often been conducted without the kind of mutual understanding that could actually move things forward. Anilayo's call for a complete and balanced picture isn't just academic, it's a roadmap.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. Theravāda has always defined itself through what it preserves. The Pāli texts, the Vinaya, the commentarial tradition. But preservation is never neutral. Every act of preservation involves a choice about what to carry forward and what to leave behind. The Bhikkhunī debate is making that choice visible in a way it hasn't been for centuries.
And the scholarship is catching up to that. Shirley's work on gender in Theravāda scholasticism, Anulayo's legal analysis, Kawanami's ethnographic research on local nuns in Burma, these are all different angles on the same underlying question. What does it mean to be Theravāda in the 21st century?
And the answer isn't settled, which is actually kind of exciting in a way.
It is. Living traditions are unsettled traditions. The ones that have all the answers tend to be the ones that stopped asking questions.
That's a line worth sitting with.
And none of them are easy reads, but they're worth it. Because this isn't just a debate about Buddhism. It's a debate about how any tradition navigates the tension between its founding ideals and its institutional history.
Tradition that has preserved its texts word for over 2,000 years. And the question it's now being asked, can a woman be fully ordained within it, turns out to be a question about the very nature of that preservation. Is the tradition's strength its rigidity, or its capacity to recover what was lost?
And the answer to that question will shape what Theravāda looks like for the next 2,000 years. That's not hyperbole, that's just what's at stake.
2 millennia of unbroken transmission. And the question now is whether the next link in that chain will be a woman. That's where we leave it.